Bojantchev. From seeing him at the many ID tables he's worked at for our club and others over the years, tonight we owe him a great debt of gratitude for joining us from Europe, where it's currently about 5 a.m. So thanks for doing this, Dimitar.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
He's a successful entrepreneur, a private pilot, self-taught mycologist who has made a mission of correcting misapplied names. His specialty is working with the Cortinarius genus, which is a mystery to most of us, but two of his projects were for mushrooms we are very familiar with. He was instrumental in changing what was considered to be the springtime pale version of Amanita calyptroderma to Amanita vernicocera, and Amanita franchettii to Amanita augusta, a very beautiful mushroom. But that's what Dimitar is here to tell us about, so welcome, Dimitar.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for being so persistent to do this thing. Are we starting officially now, or?
Yes.
So I used to be very active on the club scene, and I kind of fell off in the last 10 years, maybe because my interests are a little bit more esoteric. And I used to give a lot of talks to events, MSSF and various other clubs, and I haven't done this for a while. So we're kind of getting back here, and this is all due to you, Mike, because I know you and you're a very enthusiastic person, and I just can't say no, regardless of where I am and so forth. I always like to accommodate. You've been very patient, and particularly around the watershed foray. Are you coming? Are you not coming? Last minute deals. So all this stuff, I really appreciate that. So I started, to prepare for this presentation based on some previous variations of presentations that I have done. But now I see that a lot of the people here who have joined are rather experienced, and we're not exactly talking to a beginner crowd. So I will speed up, I will improvise a little bit, and I'm going to speed up my initial presentation, and we'll emphasize more on the current work, what's going on right now. Because, like with every major hobby, we kind of go in and out and do other things and so forth. So anyway, let me share my screen here and go through the presentation. So I've used this cover for many different presentations, because it all starts with the basic fundamental question here, the fundamental question of mushroom identification. Whether you collect for the table, whether you collect with certain informed collector, attitude, or even for desire to do science, the fundamental question for you is, what are these species? What are these mushrooms? Well, and these are just genus Cortinarius here, that they can be very variable, they can be very colorful, they can be beautiful, but trying to identify them, trying to understand them, trying to relate them to one another is a challenge. And to me, it all started in December of 2004, when my wife virtually dragged me to an MSSF event. At that time, I had no desire to deal with mushrooms whatsoever. And I was humbled and deeply impressed by the wall of mushrooms. This was a particularly eventful season where the tables were full. And I remember some people talking about it. I remember seeing Desjardins, talking about them, and I didn't understand what he's saying, but just listening to the melodic voice of somebody who understands something, it's really pleasurable. So that's when I got really deep into this thing. The next day we went to the forest with my son, and we never got out of it. We're still deep into it. So I'm going to rush through some of the early stages here, but generally, I like to make points about an informed collector versus amateur mycologist. Amateur mycologist, I call somebody who has already ambition to do a scientific contribution, whether contributing to other professionals. We all started that way, showing them things. We appreciate when they like what we show them. We appreciate when they show, appreciation for what we show them, and when they give us some answers like, what is this, and so forth. I've always said this, why us, it turns out that mycology, the way it is right now, it's not particularly, systematics, naming, and so forth is not the most well-funded, science. It's not a science that has deep relation to the industry, and therefore, lacks some of the funding. So there is a lot of space for enthusiastic, amateurs to enter into the role. And as I always say, we're all are amateurs in this field. Nobody's really paid hard to do this job. Everybody almost loses money out of doing that. So, as I say, this is a kind of a little bit aged, but still, I think, relevant. Amateur mycologists will play a crucial role in driving science in the future. Most genera require years of field work. This is very important. It is hard to get a grad student to come out of somewhere when they have limited window of 2 years or 3 years or 5 years to complete what they do, and expect them to master a particular area or particular topic of mushrooms. That many times you may stumble on 4 or 5 bad collection seasons. You need somebody who is really dedicated to it, who loves it, who goes year after year and after year, collects it from other people, has a lot of local connections in a network, people who can bring stuff to you. That's why, it is not an easy job. And I've seen some academic work in systematics being done, and in my opinion, it lacks, unless the person has been doing it for a certain significant amount of time. The 2-year master's programs, I don't think, are particularly good. Regular students, fun, helping beginners. This, I feel bad about it because I haven't been helping beginners lately, other than through mushroom, sites and stuff. And one of the things, that I like to tell people is that you can actually start eating a lot more mushrooms than you knew before, and you feel a lot more secure about your about what you're finding. So let's jump to the next slide here. This is more geared towards amateur mycologists. If you have already certain ambition to contribute to science, or to be, or to make, useful collections and so forth. I think that a lot of the first thing is to be to develop certain respect for the scientific process, a certain respect for fact, or if you don't know something, you find out the answers. Develop analytical thinking. Don't take the word of, oh, that person said this, therefore it must be true automatically. Or, a lot of people tend to be influenced by what somebody else says. And here is where I come a little bit different. I'm a doubting Thomas, by definition. And I'm always, skeptical, because many times you're going to find out that even experts who, if you have done some sports and so forth, you've dealt with people who are real masters in their field, but their lack of education and knowledge is such that they provide the most ridiculous explanations of something that they have mastered greatly. So mushrooms has that element as well. One of the important things that is absolutely must, and I think a lot of people failed, and sometimes I fail and I get very pissed with myself, is maintaining quality records, particularly mating your preserved collections to your photographs, having a solid system for keeping those, having a solid system to be able to find information, because if you cannot find information, means that you do not have it. Maintaining your collection material in a way, obviously, we don't run a state university herbarium at home. There are a bunch of boxes, but try to organize them so that when somebody asks you, hey, do you have the type collection for this? Or you can find it within 5 minutes. You don't have to search it and create a mess and so forth. So maintaining records has been one of the real important prerequisites for being able to be effective. And here, these are some old pictures showing the plight of the traveling mycologist. There is always dryers around you. You have these records, numbers. I like to take spore prints directly on the slides, which I put in these, folded pages. Maintaining these boxes, you're making sure that when you dry these mushrooms and they change their color, the labels are properly applied to them. The worst thing you want is to have things misapplied. So this is a little bit of the side fun. And this is a picture from a hotel room in New York. After a long foray in the Adirondacks, I'm scrambling here, and half of these were not fully dried when I took off to California. So it can be a little bit of a challenge, tired late at night after a long day in the foray to just deal with all these minutiae of preserving collections, which is actually the key element. That's why you have the coffee there everywhere. I'm not going to go deep in, but quality photography is necessary. I've built a couple of pages throughout my career showing the typical errors. Without a good photograph is essential evidence for a mushroom. Without a photograph, I don't accept a collection. To me, it does not exist. Quality photograph, hopefully, of a good set of specimens. A lot of mycologists, the professionals, were the worst in that. They will collect some stuff that lives in a herbarium, and they will make you think that, oh, go and look at it in a herbarium. How am I going to look at some piece of dry mushroom and figure out what this thing is? Oh, but do the microscopy. Well, doesn't work that well. Collecting skills. There are certain rules that you have to follow when you collect Cortinarius. They're different when you collect Russula. They're different from when you collect Amanita, and every genera has its own prerequisites and requirements to do when you collect them, so that then when you can communicate with professionals in the same area and be able to speak their language. When they ask you, for example, what is the KOH reaction, Russula guys would say, oh, but what does it do with phenol? Did you check it with sulfovanillin or some other crazy stuff? And you have to be able to say, oh, yes, I do. Shows that you're part of this racket. So let's go next. I'm not going to go here. Macromorphology. This is the elementary way of how we appreciate mushrooms in the field. Everybody has started here. I actually am able to take 6-year-old kids. I've practiced with my kids and other kids, and to try to set them to basically understand some basic relationships, be able to understand species down to groups. When they tell me, hey, Dad, I found a mushroom, that doesn't tell me anything. I tell them, what kind of mushroom? I found a Russula. Now you're talking, or I found an Amanita. Children, once you set them up with systematics early on, can be remarkable learners. Then you set them the right way to kind of group them. And I found a bolete. Now, is it really a bolete or is it a suillus? It's enough that it has a sponge in there. So I like to train people to collect early on in that respect. But, macromorphology has some of its challenges because, it can be misleading if you want to be able to position mushrooms within certain orders or genera and so forth. And I give this example here of Agaricales, Russulalis, which kind of look the same, but they are in a completely different order from Boletales and so forth. So developing these kind of systematics early on, I try to enforce this at forays as well. I'll talk to people a little bit without challenging them too much, but trying to break things in a manner that will be useful to them going forward, to have a conceptual mindset. Is this a stinkhorn? What is what? So they're important characters we've spoken. I'm not going to go and discuss. You all know that this was more geared towards beginners. 95% of the mycology we do, as you know, in the forays is people just writing names. And that works pretty well for our audience. That works great. This is not enough for scientific approach, but, for trade shows works well. But, and very early on, from the second time I came to MSSF gathering, I started building a little website, which is very old now, but I started organizing all my collections and try to kind of create this site, which is useful to others, but it ended up more useful to me after all, because now I refer to it from time to time. So anyway, the next level is microscopy or micromorphology. I used to be very excited about it in around 2000. First thing, by the way, that I bought as a young mycologist is a microscope and learned how to use it. I had never used one before. And because I have a kind of an engineering degree, it wasn't very hard. But, micromorphology discovers a beautiful world underneath, what you see in the macromorphology. And I used to teach some microscopic courses. There's some great editions, educational, we have here in the United States as well as in Europe. And you start discovering the real aspects of the mushrooms and all the weird things. Now, for many years, mycologists, due to the lack of better tools, put placed a whole lot of confidence in their microscopy. Microscopy became like, you know, the basic tool for many to identify species. And here I have some countless pictures of cystidia, various cells. First, we all can collect and look at the spores. So I have accumulated through the years hundreds of photos, you know, the spores of different species and so forth. And this was great, learning to make decent photographs using a regular microscope also has its tricks and challenges. And microscopy was great until where I felt very early on that mycologists place a whole lot more confidence in microscopy than they should. And this is particularly challenging between closely related species. Sometimes you can find a mycologist who will tell you, you know, I can tell an Asian guy from a European guy by the size of their blood cells. Well, you can probably derive some scientific study to show that the Vietnamese red blood cells are about 1% larger than those of the Dutch or the Norwegian. But this is not exactly a useful identification tool. This is like saying, yeah, I know that the Norwegians are on average 3 centimeters or 1 inch taller than the Frenchmen, but that doesn't mean that when you go to the airport, you can see a tall guy and say, hey, you're Norwegian or you're Frenchman or so on. So they tend to extract, in my opinion, a lot more confidence based on microscopy. The truth of the matter is, some may disagree with me, but I think it's a solid thing, is that between closely related species, you're not going to find significant micromorphological differences. And there are some genera which are brutal in that respect. In Cortinarius, you're not going to find anything interesting. And Tuloma, I mean, you know, people do a lot of chemistry and try to do some chemical things in the 60s and the 70s. But I think it was all created situations where people invent species. And Elsie was telling me the story of one French guy, Marcel Bon, I think. They sent him 5 pieces of the same mushroom, and he named it 5 different species, you know. I've seen that happen, you know, and, you know, this is excusable because this was the stage of our knowledge. So then we get to the next level where already, you know, already we are blessed to be, because this opened the gates of a lot of, you know, possibilities as far as being able to be effective in science, the molecular age. Before this, I will be the first to admit I've made brutal errors. Big mycologists have made brutal errors. It is impossible not to make brutal errors. And, you know, some of these species are not easy to tell about. Some are very cryptic, hard, you know, you're not going to find much microscopy and so forth. So here we are with the stage, and we have these projects of the yellow amanitas, you know. You look at them, and there are a bunch of them out there, and you can get pretty excited about trying to draw some conclusions about what is what. But and some very remarkable scientists have indeed created systematics which are very well supported by the modern studies. But in 50% of the cases, we as a community failed. We just didn't know any better. So here is a little bit of an early introduction to, you know, trying to tell things apart. And I always give this with the Cortinarius. These are brown Cortinarius from the Sierra Nevada in the spring. And I was hit by that wall. Look at them. What is what? They all look alike, man. And even their spores are very much similar. Same size, no interesting cystidia to tell them apart. And even up to this day, when we have described some of them, I kind of wonder, like, man, which one is with? Now, I recognize this one, mainly because it follows these cavities, creates cavities late in life, and it has certain particularities about it that I can identify with a significant degree of success. But overall, the problem is not easy, you know. Or these are section anomaly, you know. We described a bunch of these lately. Most of them have subglobal spores. Sorry for this web page being a little bit out of whack. Or these, you know. Now I can tell a lot more. And now that we have actually cheated with the molecular with the molecular data, it's a lot easier for me actually to go back to the field and say, oh yeah, I know what this is. But there was a time when you look at these and you feel like, these are all yellow phlegmaceums, and you read the books and you don't know, are these different than the European ones? We didn't have literature for Cortinarius at the time, your American one. Only thing were some articles in Mycological that there were zero color photos. You look at some drawings. So I ended up using European literature, which I use until this day for general comparison. And then you look at these and feel like, are they like the European? Are they not? You don't quite know. You go to websites, you go to some forums, people say, no, if it's American, it's different, which is not necessarily the case in all cases. So these were some of the challenges that I personally faced up until 2008 and 2009, when I realized that, man, unless I take this thing to the next level, this is completely useless exercise. This will solve no problem. And, it will be just wasting of time. I'm not going to go deep into mycology, but, understanding biogeography is an interesting aspect. Desjardins made an interesting experiment with the Hawaiian Islands, which are a very nice island, a very nice laboratory to investigate how endemites were developed. And they found some correlation with species in Costa Rica and so forth. So this slide is more part of my molecular presentation. Here we're going to skip that. Let me see what practical implications were. And this relates to, going back to the field, looking at these species and seeing, what is related to what genetically. It's very similar to the metaphor of, you see a dolphin, you see a shark, and you see a human, and then wonder like, which one is related to whom? Now, if you look at purely macromorphology, they all have fins. You can probably think that the dolphin and the shark are related and the human is out there, but it turns out the opposite way. Dolphins and humans are very close and the sharks are way distant species. So external appearance may be misleading at times. At one time, mycologists used to group mushrooms based on what they look like, puffballs. In a very early stage, they kind of consider that puffballs are all part of the same group. Then in later 19th century, they realized, every order has its own, forms of puffballs or, different kind of formations. So you cannot use macromorphology completely. Here, are some entomomas that we have broken into several subgenera at the time, which turned out not to be molecularly well supported, but they vary a lot in color. And it may turn out that this blue one is closely related to this one, and this one to this one. And you find that a lot of things, have evolved, maybe returned back to some other stage, re-evolved and so forth. So some of these evolution is not easy to trace. Some more field implications that was very revealing to me. At some point, I looked at the Amanita vaginata group, and I ran these trees, and it became very obvious to me that, the basic group of the vaginata was pretty much gray. The group of the fulva and so forth had a very strongly developed rust coloration. So now, anytime I saw a vaginata in the field that had rust, I know exactly where to place it. And I know that it was in the group of, this is kind of 10 years old, but it's part of, it's in a different kind of a group than the typical, vaginata, which are mostly almost exclusively gray-white, with one recent exception that I just learned that has different color. And all the colorful vaginata, amongst them our velosa, they're part of this Crocea velosa group, which really become orange. So now already, based on cheating in a way, looking at the molecular data, it became a lot easier for me in the field to be able to tell the Amanitas, and say, hey, this is it. These rusty colorations are very typically, part of this particular clade. So these are some real practical implications that, to me, were part of the revealing exercise. One second here, let me return back and see. some recent discoveries we're not going to talk. But generally, scientists became very busy in the 2000s, going down into really developing deeper understanding of the relationships between all of the genera, the intergeneric, and so forth. Let's continue here. Applications. Let's go to the next. Here is an example with the genus Russula that when you build a tree and when you start looking at the species, you soon develop, understanding that certain types of green mild Russulas, they're within one group. Those very low-level ones that actually, according to scientists, they should be part of Lactarius, but all these Russula brevipes compacted, the big white Russula, they are somehow a kind of a more basal kind of Russula, and some people, well, they don't have a milk. According to several Russulologists, they actually belong in the milk caps, And then you start finding these are all very field relevant information that the groups lower in this tree tend to have the more pale white spore color, and they tend to generally be more accurate. And then as you develop and you go up, you start finding, groups which have deeper yellow color of the spores. You can see also that under the microscope. And then you reach one stage when you realize that it's relatively rare to have a Russula that has deep yellow spore print and be hot. These are very few, actually. So you kind of develop this inner mind about how this thing developed, and this helps a lot in the field. That's when you can kind of look at the Russula and say, yeah, I think this is in this group. I think that is in that group. Unfortunately, for forays, that's not very easy because everybody wants species. Well, I'm satisfied sometimes to say, yeah, this is in this group, and that is a kind of the end of my identification. So I kind of rushed through several previous talks, and I'm going to go back into my research aspects. This is as far as 2012 when I last spoke at event. By that time, I had described, 11 species of Cortinarius, 3 phlegmaceans. I put a lot of effort into writing each species as a separate, paper. We did, as Mike said earlier, some interesting work on the Amanitas. I just felt that this is like sticking like a sour thumb, that we have not put a proper name of these very common species. And working in collaboration here with Professor Mike Davis and other people, we were able to use, genetic data and put them together. And in the process of writing the Amanita vernicocora, we actually touched on some very interesting nomenclature aspects. That's why I kind of asked Sean Pennycook, who was the nomenclature editor of Mycotaxon at the time, to join us. And this is a long, story. We can go through paper and so forth. I didn't forget some of the details, but it became a good paper because it actually clarified the proper naming even for the full version of the Amanita vernicocora. So I did some work on Amanita. I have still a project that I haven't put enough effort into to make sense of all the yellow Amanitas. Actually, I have made sense of the yellow Amanitas. I know exactly how they are, but writing a paper about it is where, it gets really bruising, because then you have to go through the review process. And then you have Elsa and you have other, distinguishing mycologists, and then you're going to get hit. You have to do a lot of extra work and so forth. So that's been holding me back. But Cortinarius, this was 10 years ago. As of now, I have described between 48 and 49 species. And this, this is also considering that for a long time I've been going to other hobbies. I'm commercial pilot, not pirate pilot. I'm an IT professional. I have all kinds of other hobbies and so forth. So sometimes I may be less active in the mycologist scene than other times. But in general, now I will jump the number of species that I have described. Here is a long list of them. I oftentimes go and have to review them because it is really it would be embarrassing at a show. One of the things I hated about professional mycologists at the time is that they very often don't know what they have described. They don't recognize it. They just wrote something up and so forth. Unfortunately, I was caught in that as well a little bit, but I'll go to that in a second. But here are some of the significant collections. There will be a few more Amanitas, but not immediately. And then we go to some beautiful Cortinariuses. They're just spectacular. There was a major paper that was just completed, and here is a list of some of the papers that I have been involved with. There are about 10 or 12. Early on, we all started writing these individual, papers in mycotaxon. That is a lot of work. That was a lot more work, but than in my opinion is work, because you spend so much time with typographical minutia. One of the guys, one of the reviewers told me, "You don't seem to like your commas, don't you?" And I'm like, man, I was about to punch him and tell him, "You geek, I have bigger things to worry about than that." So early on, we started with these mycotaxon articles, and one species at a time. But this was a great training exercise for me, because I requested the people that would be probably most sensitive to my work to be the reviewers. I went to Joan Mirari in Washington. I went to Desjardins, then I went to Else, and it's amazing the kind of stuff they can discover, particularly Else. She's a very honest reviewer. She finds stuff that you didn't believe is there. 70% I agree with, 30% I think it's opinionated, but bottom line, she finds brutal errors, which are errors no matter how you review them. They're errors. So you have to go through the process. Then later on, I became engaged in a lot of joint projects. One of the beautiful things about the Cortinariologists right now is that we're in a highly cooperative mode. That wasn't the case early on. I believe that I would take credit for some of that myself, because I made it, I don't want to sound egotistical, but I put very early effort on that, we should cooperate, we should keep the doors open, and we should not be egotistical about who gets credit for what, because you can't keep people engaged with you unless, you honor their work. And in the last 10 years, it has been extremely collaborative. No one of us publishes any species without first sending it through each one of us and saying, do you have supporting material? Do you not? And there is this pair of Cortinariologists from Finland, husband and wife, Tuula Niskanen and Kari Limatainen, who actually went and did the brutal effort of sequencing all of the type collections they could get their hands on. And that opened the door for all of us. That's why I give them a lot of gratitude. We had slightly bumpy relationship early on, because Europeans tend to be more hidden about what they do. They still have, you go to Unitend and their, databases for sequences where they have, this one is held back, or secret or something. That's the most annoying thing, to show somebody a box of candy and telling you, no, you can't open it. This is secret. So I started to work in groups with Cortinariologists, because it was a lot easier to me. I have a lot of specimens that I can contribute. And, I'm usually author 2, 3, 4 new species per paper, but they do the bulk of work. This is a mycological progress article that took probably 2 years to write. This mycological, article in Mycologia that John Murati took the main effort to write was brutal from a standpoint of reviewers. And they I considered some of the reviews to be really weak, because you have non-Cortinariologists, reviewing several of the top Cortinariology people and asking some questions which are like meaningless. But my colleagues were very patient to answer to all these, and so forth. So some interesting papers here at Mycological Progress, a lot of authors. I got somewhere here with Capus. Actually, there was one species in this case. There was a big review of subgenus Leproseby that was done. That took also 3-4 years to write this paper. I have like 3 species in that. But the main brunt of the work was taken by Joan Mirari. Then another very important one, section anomaly. The main brunt of the work was done by a great Hungarian guy, Balint Dima. with whom we share, initials. He's DB and I'm DB. And I got the same group of people. We see Emma here and so forth. And just recently, something that is coming out right now in Journal of European Cortinariology is, species from Bulgaria and Europe in general. This is the first thing that I'm engaged. No, actually, no, not the first, but probably the third or the fourth that I'm engaged with from Europe. And now I see Elze. So one of the painful aspects of finding names for mushrooms is that you have to go through this super painful botanical code. And the part is that I learn these rules every once in 5 years, and then I forget them. And then we just came up with a name of about a species with Shannon about a week ago, and she ran it by Elsa, and she immediately put a couple of bullet holes in it. That it doesn't match the gender of the genus and so forth. And I kind of, noticed that this thing that I was just showing here, Havros, also has a little bit of that problem. So I was covered there by 4 or 5 PhDs, and I asked them, guys, what's going on here? And they tell me, you know what? The only people who get pissed are the people who know Latin, and they are so few. And I said, okay, let them go. They'll be pissed. We can't be forever, kept by these absolutely archaic rules, because I like short, expressive name. But then at the same time, I'm sensitive not to break the long tradition of people who have gone to study to universities, learning Latin. But at the same time, like every language, and like every human practice, it evolves. So naming these things has been a painful process. And I'm going through it right now with a bunch of species that I'm in the process of describing now that I had a pause of a few years. And finally, I've told myself, man, you're going to get and finish this job, because there is a lot of scientific information that I have that if I die tomorrow, it's going to be wasted. So for the first time, I have the sense of urge to complete these. So now I have to find names. And, I work hard, and I went right back and reread the code, really. And this time I'll try to keep it. But based on the research, we're working on 3 different species right now with Shannon, who's on this call. I'm working separately on something that Jog has been asking me to complete for ages. I will put soon 18 new phlegmaceums, and this time I'm going to be careful about the names. These are still work in progress. We're going to name my friend Ron Pastorino finally and for all, because he's been a great contributor, a very interesting material. Now, this name will probably, I'll talk to us about, or let me first do some more research. So there is a lot more stuff coming. I project that there, and again, everything has been discussed with the other Cortinariology, and I put these, we put these like, basically documents. I send them around and with a sequence and so forth, and then they respond, yeah, we have it. This is JFA, this is Amirati has this collection, Tulan Iskanen has this. So in the authorship, we're going to take that into consideration. So we work in a very collaborative fashion, with everybody, so that, we really, when you have everybody in the same room, it's a lot easier to create something which is relevant. And, then you have confidence. And, we have into situations where, for example, the Finns send me some mushroom from California. And by the way, you also to be 1 second, let me show you. I constantly make myself and maintain a phylogenetic tree. And I'm going to talk about it in a second. First of all, any questions thus far? Anything that I missed to say, or if I rushed too much?
There was a question in the chat. Let's see here.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, no worries. Let me pull it up here. What is the current status of splitting up Cortinarius into 8 new genera?
We don't have to
So-
get into that right now, because I know that's a rabbit hole. but
No, it's not.
not very
It's,
quickly.
I
If
think
we
it's
can hold
no,
it
I-
for the end of the talk and we can go into it later, maybe? Up
No,
to you
I think
guys.
I think it's a very relevant. Let's get it right now because when my good friends Kari Limatainen and Tula did that, I knew that they're working on that. I was a little bit depressed about it because I like to keep the genus together. I think that there is no reason to break it like the politologists did into 100 different genera. But since they did it, and since I respect their work, I decided, what, I will accept it. So now I have accepted it, and everything that we write, maybe Shannon can show that. Now I try to comply. So generally, not everything in mycology has to be the way you like it. So sometimes you have to accept it. So I accepted it. Again, this has a lot to do with my liking of these people, respecting their work. So that's it. So now we are breaking things, and a lot of the species that we're going to describe are not more Cortinarius. They're going to be Calonarius or Taxterogaster, or some are going to be in the pure, some are going to be in the pure group. Let me show you something here that we're working on right now with Shannon. No, sorry, this is not. But we try to comply with it. So as you see here, some species, I immediately have to, this is genus Calonarius, subgenus Calonarius, section Calonarius. So I have accepted, a little bit grudgingly, but I have accepted their division, and that's it. It's worthless to argue at this point. I believe to have unity because we're all on the same page. Even I would not have done it if you ask me, but they've done it and we go with it. And as you see here, it's more formal now to make you think about when you describe something, where does it fall? And, in a way that it fosters. But one of the important things, and I didn't talk a lot about it, as a part of the molecular approach to things, is being able to understand what phylogeny is and how does it work. And this is where, frankly, a lot of the informed collectors and the amateurs fall off the train. One of the reasons why I can a little bit less involved is that because about 10 years ago, I used to work very hard to get people to appreciate. And I think it's not really that hard to build phylogenies, to understand what's going on, to even understand the statistical methods behind it. Because it's very interesting, can get enormously complicated. But to be able to master any particular group or genera or subgenera, you have to constantly deal with some evolutionary trees which are based on the best knowledge that we have. There are various genetic markers. This is a separate discussion. We use in Cortinarius a lot more, so these are called ITS1 and ITS2, which I think work great in this genus. They don't necessarily work very well in other genera. But you have to constantly have these trees. And the easiest way to compare species is to say, hey, somebody sends you material, you run a tree, you see where it falls, then you do a lot of looking at the actual sequences and so forth. Every once in a while you find some isolated species, like for example, that doesn't quite fall into the other one. So every mycologist does that, and we as now having accepted a little bit of the title of professional contributors, do that. And this is like your most important cheat sheet. And as you see, there are a lot of cryptic names here, but they're type collections. These are very important. Once you compare to the type collection, you can kind of get a sense as to where we belong. This is an accepted way right now of doing the work. Now, this is getting a little bit into the molecular ages, but in the early stages, people used to have an improper selection of material and went to draw conclusions that were wrong. So how you select your material, and Elsa has opinion on that, is very important. I think that now we have been able to do a lot better job. You see, in a lot of the studies that people do about human genetics, and where life came and what group moved from somewhere. They're based on so few data points that they draw conclusions that I have no confidence in them. You know, when people moved between Europe and Asia and back and forth, how many times, and when did the Scandinavians went to Scandinavia, and maybe they did it 10 times on 10 different waves. People tend to draw conclusions. The favorite subject, what are the Bulgarians? I read it all the time, and they start finding some various things, you know. So this, what I'm trying to say is that there are wrong and right ways, and the future probably will show us that we've done some things wrong as we learn. So even if you use the latest methods, you can perfectly well draw the wrong conclusions. And we have had a couple of species that are so hard to understand. They are so different. They have such a different habitat, but they have the same ITS sequence. What do you do with that? So sometimes we say, hey, we don't have the proper knowledge right now to describe these, but maintaining these trees is an important and fundamental aspect. You know, I maintain, as I showed earlier, my Russula tree. Let me increase this in size. This effectively is doing this tree and putting pictures together of the species within the clade. Man, you surely understand a lot of things then. You see similarities, you see the range colorations, and then you start to sort of, they're not the same, they vary, but you start to understand the range of coloration, how it can. So maintaining this kind of personal database and of knowledge is important. I showed parts of this tree earlier. You see how they change from these, you know, brevipes to the various groups. And then it becomes a lot easier for you to go and say, now this makes sense, and how the sport changes and the basic colors. So this is where, you know, I draw the line pretty much between the mycologists who can be individual. And this is how it actually, I ended up, just see where is this thing. This is how I ended up, you know, being involved in description of species, where I did mostly the molecular work. I break them by where I'm the first author or I'm a second author. I ended up in some where I was a second or tertiary author. And this, by the way, you see species which we have described as a group because we have common, you know, collections. But then I ended up in some situations that I did exactly what I hate from the mycologists. I named things that I've never collected myself. So that's why I break it down into secondary author, no collection. Sorry, I did something. Oh. Apologize. Secondary author, no collections. Because I did the molecular group for other people, the molecular work for other people. And I'm not proud of it because although that I'm written as an author, I don't think I know the species well. And, you know, somebody will legitimately criticize me, where the hell did you put your name behind it? Well, I know, mea culpa, you know, but generally, part of the work of a mycologist is also continue to support the species which are named, continue to understand them, continue to describe new collections to show that maybe what we described earlier is not exactly correct, maybe correct it later. Of course, you get into small species like these, you know, that we've seen once. This is one example where, you know, I will need to take, for species that I'm the first author, I need to have minimum 3 quality collections before I describe. You know, but I've been engaged in things where I'm second author of things which are less than that. You know, some very cryptic species that, you know, maybe you need to continue with your knowledge gathering about these species so that you're a good, you know, you show good husbandry to the species. I don't like mycologists when they go describe something, you meet them 10 years, 15, 20 years later and ask them, hey, can you help me with this species? And they tell, oh man, I don't know. I was doing a PhD then, I don't remember anything. That's not good enough to me. That's actually sloppy. And I try to break that sloppiness by maintaining these sheets and constantly increasing the photographs and studying and then not being caught. And I'm gonna wrap, I don't know how much time we have, but there have been some amazing discoveries here. This collection here to the left is a Bulgarian Bulgarian vernal fruiting phlegmaceum. This is from Scandinavia. They're the same species. You'd never think how that's possible and so forth. So anyway, let's open this a little bit to question and answer. If you guys have anything, we can continue in a more free format. But I just wanted to wrap up. There is a lot of current research going on. I believe that I'll have probably about 30 more species of Cortinarius, 40. Actually, I'm putting 18 right now, which I consider tier 1 work, which are really ready. They should have been put down 5 years ago. There is a problem with the journals. You know, that's extremely painful aspect. A lot of people now are going directly to index from government. You know, I know that all the mycologists and I used to test it, but the quality of our work, I feel confident because all of the Cortinariologists are involved in it. All of us who have relevant knowledge are in the same room. There is nobody who can review this work other than the people who are on the authorship list. So in that respect, sometimes I think short-circuiting this thing and just putting the species out, it's a better thing than we make you write books about it later on versus going into this endless waiting in journals, and they change, and I don't know which journals are active now, and some journals don't like species, description. They prefer to do more fundamental work. So there's some of the current challenges to mycologists. A lot of Cortinarius guys who used to be Cortinarius, when they're doing their PhDs, they moved on and now they're ecologists and so forth. So, they've kind of moved out the field. I try to stay Cortinarius. I have a great ambition to do work on Russula. I have a lot of material, but first I have to finish this job before I start another one. So that's what I remember to say for now. You guys can take it further.
If anybody has any questions, I would say let's put them into the chat.
Oh, there's quite a few
comments. Dimi, are you okay reading them yourself?
Yeah, I'm reading them right now. Do you think that relying on barcoding on the ITS region will remain sufficient moving forward? Depends for what. For species separation, I think it's very adequate. We tried other things. We tried other regions. For most of the Garicales, I think ITS will remain valid. You also have to consider that there is a huge installed base. There is a lot of already information. You can't just start running new markers. But for certain general, take Entoloma, ITS is not good. Take hygroscopy and some of the hygrophily, ITS is not good. Take Inocebi. Inocebi is brutally different. You can find some species which are so indistinguishable and they have more than 5% of ITS. So it depends per genera. When we did the work on Amanita, we picked 4 genes. I can tell you that 3 of those were kind of useless because they had a too high degree. Long in subunit, RPB1, RPB2. So it entirely depends on the genera, what kind of genetic markers they use. But ITS will undoubtedly, in our lifetime, I think will remain a solid one, useful. Okay, it's a beautiful visual there. As a visual learner, that would be so helpful. Okay, let's see. Naming type species. I work for an entomologist who worked collecting in Africa and named his species with local dialect names, prove beautiful, some interesting pictures. So, Colin, I had a series of species in Telemonia, which I named entirely by American, Indian names. You see, Cortinarius oloni.
I saw the Miwok and I saw the Oloni.
Yeah.
Very good. So, it also tells you where it lives.
It tells you to an extent. Now there is one that is pretty spread that I called Athabascus, which is the Athabascan people. But then if you take a look at the Native American language groups, they're pretty much also spread. They have 7 language groups from what I understand, which are totally unintelligible between each other. So I did that for a while as a homage, to the native people. Plus, it tells you immediately this is not a European, because if it is a Flavocitrinus, there's some European guy who's written. But I don't always keep up to that, because then certain amount of descriptiveness is lost. So for example, this one is a very common species in Salt Point with an orange belt. So it's Aurora armillatus is a kind of a natural name for it. I mean, this one I called exquisitus, you know, because it's an exquisite card. It's just super gorgeous, you know. So I like to do Native American. I like to do place like, you know, Eldoradoensis and so forth. But that does face criticism because we find that Eldoradoensis is common throughout the, you know, this one here is somewhere. This one, you find that it's common throughout the Pacific Northwest all the way to Montana and the Rocky Mountains, you know, so you call it from El Dorado. So every system of naming can be criticized.
What can you do?
And, anybody can criticize anything. And West Coast not so splitting good. Oh yeah, so we discussed that. Okay, sorry, I was a bit slow to share all the time. Okay, so need. Okay, thank you, Karen. So all the Cortinarius mycorrhizal, as far as it is known, yes, but as you know, I learned from Tom Else, Tom. What is your boss?
Bruns, Tom Bruns.
Bruns, you know, as we learn from Tom Bruns and other researchers in mycorrhizae, things are a lot more complicated than they are. I mean, you take one of them, Eastern Morchellus, it's a mycorrhizal with its host tree, the elm, up until the tree dies. Then it consumes it. You know, so we find that, you know, the first page in the book of mycorrhizae is, there is no black and white in nature. You have 101 variations. And we know that the Chinese were able to force, imagine that, a mycorrhizal matsutake to be saprophitical, you know. People say it's not that tasty, but imagine the kind of a Chinese torture to take these mycorrhizal species and force it to be saprophitical. But, you know, I believe from what we know, for so far, they are all mycorrhizal, but, you know, it would be a bold statement to say that we're not going to learn other details because we know that certain species have certain habits and some appear fruiting on wood. Now you can say, oh, this is an attachment point, but how do we know, man? You know, I'm sure we're going to discover other things. Oh, yeah, so Emma is pointing out that, yeah, when you start breaking things intergenetically, where you cannot just rely only on ITS1. I've been doing ITS1 for my trees. They're not publishable material. They're sufficiently informative, but to start breaking things between more distant groups, particularly, you know, between the distant groups, you need to use some lower resolution markers as well. And that's why all the people, and there was a major paper that came out, the one that broke Cortinarius in several subgenera. They used a bunch of markers, and these guys know what they're doing exactly. So yes, ITS1 and ITS2 is better for closely related things versus bigger, but yeah. Thank you for that comment, Emma. Let me go here into the trees. There's certain smaller trees, you know, let's say if you're trying to do leprosopy with all the existing material, here is why ITS1 works pretty well. If you want to get yourself oriented as to people give you something, and then you have this not collected, this weird thing that is on a branch on its own, then you have to wonder about maybe the sequence was not good. But then you get a second one, or you review the sequence, it's perfect. We do this thing a lot, by the way. You see another one here that's sitting separately. Then you have a bunch of common ones. Then the question is, these that are just a little bit different, how different are they? And then you realize that, you know, there are ways to judge, you know, even there, what breaks for differences. But one of the common areas where I think we're going to find surprises in the future is, I think that what we're doing right now is like the microscopy mycologists of the previous era. We put a little bit too much faith into our current conclusions in, you know, in the molecular methods. And I'm sure that we will be corrected at some point. People say, nah, this is not exactly the way you imagined it. Raspberries are edible. Yep. Yeah, in fact, I don't advise that, but one I'm naming the Delectabilis because one second here, let me find it in there. Which is a beautiful edible. One second. This species is an excellent edible. You know, again, this is a little bit, you know, people criticize me that I'm exposed. This one is edible too, Optimus. In fact, with Cortinarius, you can pretty much know who are the poisonous groups. They're around, I mean, there are several poisonous groups, but I think that a lot of these other species, they're edible. I am not sure how tasty these are, but this is an excellent one. I had pictures somewhere of eating it and it's beautiful. Yeah, ponderosus, I personally find it disgusting if you ask me, but it can be available. It can be available in huge quantities. But I don't like it. I don't like the smell of it. But this one here, Delectabilis, is really good. And this whole group of Variecolores, I think are excellent edibles. And they're easy to identify. They're with a little bit of training, you know. I mean, generally, avoid when it comes down to, you know, there's several groups. There are from the phlegmaceums, there are the splendens groups, which are known to be poisonous. I don't think I have any. This one, for example, this one I'll suspect to be poisonous because it's right into this group of splendens. They have this very distinct yellow coloration, you know. Oralanus is a well-known group that is poisonous, but I know this one, it's also edible. Very nice, Botato occidentalis. This whole group is very edible. They're nice chunky cords, you know, and, you know, if one gets, you know, used to them, you know, it can be effective. Again, I mean, there are a lot of experimenters out there. I'm not exactly an experimenter. I've done it rarely, but in general, what happens is that within the same group, you know, you find that species tends to be equally edible. Now, I've heard that that's not always the case, but you know, with Cortinarius at least, without much experience, because very few people eat them, I have ventured, and I have also taken advice from other people who have actually played with them. I know people who say, I don't know what species, but this is very edible. I've met a couple of these kind of hippie guys. They don't know what they're eating, but they're eating it. And that's been a great piece of knowledge. That's why I find nothing wrong with discussing edibility at higher mycological gatherings. A lot of the Europeans that tend to be a little bit snotty about it. Oh, we're not talking about edibility here. Well, why not? What's wrong with that? That's also part of the experience. It's found in the Delectabilis is found a lot on the coast, all over the California coast. I have many collections of it. Thank you. Okay, Kristen, Idaho. Oh, yeah, Idaho is great. I've been doing presentations at Macau gathering. There's some very interesting environment there. What is the host tree? You know, I personally think it's a 10 oak, but you know, it is very close to the European Cortinarius largus. And again, let's go to my tree here. When I do these things, let me find my, it's really crowded, but I all the time go to my trees if I want to answer some of these questions here. These are 1640 phlegmaceums. So we search for largus. And this is the species that's there. This is the California variecolor. It's in a pretty good group of, you know, species, but this is what I was showing there in the pictures. And, you know, some of these sequences will have to be worked a little bit. But it is, you know, speaking of hosts, those can vary. As you know, with the boletes, I mean, you know, in our coast, they're under bishop pine. You go up north, they're under spruce. Sometimes the host tree can be, we can get overly wrapped up into that. But in general, in other areas, it's been very, very useful because there is a huge distinction between the oak courts in California versus the conifer courts. And this is very important to also understand. A lot of, one of the things about the oak courts, they're more southern species and so forth, you find a lot more separation between them due to the ice ages and how species moved up and down, versus the northern hemisphere conifer courts. They are a lot closer between the continents. In the northern hemisphere, in the conifers, you find a lot of species in Alaska, Scandinavia, and Canada, which are the same species. Once you get down into the oaks, you find a lot more distant relationship to European oak logging and so forth. So to that extent, the host is important. But this one, I think, is related to 10 oak because roughly I found it only where 10 oak is present. I don't know what's going on. Last time I was on McCall was in 2008. And by the way, speaking of Idaho and the Northern Hemisphere, we did spruce collections. You go to Idaho, and next week I was in Bulgaria in a spruce forest. You can't tell the difference. It's exactly the same kind of environment. You find the sarcodones, Idaho is very rich in different sarcodones, I was amazed. But the spruce and the conifer zone, the species are a lot more similar. You go to Scandinavia, they have the same big white Russula that we have in our Pacific Northwest. You go to Salt Point, you find these big dish-sized Russulas. You go to Scandinavia, you find the same thing, Well, in the oaks between California and France and Bulgaria, that's where you find some interesting things. Medical courts. No, oak courts in general. Generally, the courts which are related to the broadleaf trees tend to group together. What is in Europe a very common host is the beech, the Fagus sylvatico, Fagus orientalis. The closest relationship to Fagus here in our area is 10 oak. What is very interesting to say though, the same thing with Russula. You have far more relationship, and this is probably a separate talk on the biodistribution. You have a lot more relationship between both Western and Eastern courts of Russulas to Europe than between one another. There is almost no intersection between mycorrhizal species of Russula and Cortinarius and Amanita as well, between the East Coast and the West Coast. They're vastly different, but they are both related to Europe. So there's some interesting studies, on how things moved and the role of the ice ages that played, every time, the ice moved down, it killed everything and pushed it south. And somebody was telling me that in Mexico, they have the highest diversity of oak trees and so forth. This is very, I used to have slides about that, which are purely conjecture on my side, but it's very interesting science. Interesting. We're working on sequencing the sarcodon and hydnellum. The sarcodon is fascinating, and again, the kind of things I found in Idaho. And speaking of biodiversity, this common knowledge that the East Coast has more species of Boletalis than Western, in North America and Europe combined, multiplied by 3. You go in a forest in New York and you find the most diverse boletes. In California, it's like in Europe, you find, maybe 10, 15 species, So here is very interesting. Thank you. And so on. Yep. But I'll try to be a little bit more connected now with the mycological community because I feel again the spark. And I will definitely, this time I've hit myself on the face the other day and told myself, I want you to complete this thing before you move into anything else. So at least I want to complete the Cortinarius descriptions. And maybe put some kind of a book or a visual aid. The problem with books is that it's a lot of work and it's a very esoteric subject. I was talking Cortinarius one time and then comes Alan Rockefeller and then sucked all my audience to talk about the psychedelic mushrooms, You can't beat the psychedelic mushrooms, with that. I can talk all day long about genetics and stuff, but when people hear the funny mushrooms and they get like a vacuum cleaner, it's very hard to predict whether it will come, how much. These are some of the hardest to predict aspects, of you know, every one of us, the first question has been to have a theory of when things will fruit. Every single theory has been busted. Now, I've spoken to professors and people as well, and even they don't know. One of the subjects with Tom Bruce was, like, why, one thing we know that, wood tree mushrooms tend to be far less influenced by the humidity at the moment. They seem to draw humidity from the roots of the trees, and they appear in the heat of the summer. But for the Cortinarius specific, I don't know if it's going to be a good year or a bad year. Lately, I rely on other collectors to tell me what is going on. Right now, I have the same question in Bulgaria. It's a little bit late in the season. A few years ago in October, I collected the most spectacular, volume of interesting material. Today, nothing. It's already February, mid of February. It's going to get cold soon. We just don't know, but it will always surprise you. The rule is, if you don't go, you won't know. Although that, some of the watershed forays, as Mike McCurdy was saying, we knew it's going to be bad. We went, it was bad. We got disappointed, and that's it. But walking in the woods is good. That's at least is a. And I'm not as much into the Facebook forums as I used to be. But again, there are some great forums out there, which really serve people. And as a general note, is that people who tend to gravitate towards clubs and forums are far safer about collecting mushrooms in general. Those outlying experts who have no contact with anybody else, they're usually the risk group. Different between oaks and conifers. Oh, absolutely, undoubtedly. Although that, again, in some groups, the host can be absolutely important. In other groups, we see migrations, but the host information, it's a fundamental one for any kind of mycological work. We always have to, but again, Amanita muscaria, I mean, even our Boletus edulis, in parts of Europe where I go, Boletus edulis is strictly a conifer species, either between spruce and a pine. But then some people found Boletus edulis in some places under oaks in California. Some people have found it under eucalyptus. There are a lot more things that go into place, but in general, host is important. You go into a new plantation of pine, you're going to find a lot of Psilus. You're probably not going to find much else. You go into a mature forest, there's certain species that don't exist there. So that is important. But how it works exactly, I think sometimes it's a combination of hosts. I've oftentimes asked the people with Psilus. There's certain Psilus under Douglas fir you only find on the coast. You do not find it in Sierra Nevada. I don't know why. There are certain species of Psilus that you found on the Douglas fir in our area, but only a few Psiluses have transferred to Europe, which are actually rare here. So there are a lot more dependencies there that, I think have to be studied. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to finish the course because otherwise it's a lot of wasted effort, if I don't complete that. But I used to teach a couple of genetic courses and so forth. But as I said, at the Soma camp, I did a couple of courses, Paul Stamets came and so forth, but you realize at some point that, the audience is limited again. When they hear psychedelic mushrooms, everybody flies out the door. So. And again, what always stimulates me is looking at these beautiful pictures, trying to make sense of them, trying to develop a species concept. I have to have a lot of pictures for them to read. This is not a representative picture. This is from our friends from Finland who made it at a foray. To me, this is not one piece, but here you have a representative, far more representative. When you have several collections, I have this one I've collected over and over, This one, I actually know what it looks like and confidently identify this super common in Salt Point State Park, you know. So sometimes you find that between collections, things are so different. That's why I've had a few of these specimens. I can go into a lot of specifics of species, you know, some are so close to others, now you wonder, is this a different? And here is the stature of the mushroom. These are tall and lanky, except that somebody showed me a very chubby collection. So you can't always draw conclusions about what things look in terms of stature. This one I could have sworn is something else for, you know, for a while until I finally sequenced it. And again, always you keep trees, 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 and again trees. Without this thing, you're naked. Without this thing, you have absolutely zero standing, even before yourself. And there's some super interesting, super strange, you know, as you see semi-sequoia Cortinarius, which is very closely related to a European one, which is not. And this is only in our Pacific Northwest. And you kind of, these kind of mysteries, when you look at these things, and you feel like, why did it evolve that way? You know, and this one doesn't even have smell. So, and we have enough collections to describe it, and it's very similar to a European species that looks nothing like it. So probably I can do an entire talk about, you know, these little mysteries that, in a way, I'm not a religious man, but this is like how the hand of God moves, you know. You see strange things and then try to make sense out of them with the barcodes. Here you see significant amount of similarity, but I want to get down to one that you don't. This one smells like grapes. Unbelievable smell like grapes. It's a gorgeous one here. And here is one that is killing me. Look at this. Look at the color forms. And these are independent collections. Some is totally brown. Some is blue. Some seem to be in the middle. So you have some of these that macromorphology will really not work very well. And you know, I'm gonna call this one, what was the name I described? Peronusialis or something, you know, which is like extremely unusual in terms of the coloration. So each one of these is a little journey that you go and collect. This is very interesting. These are Springfield Gymnasiums you'll find in a mountain. One is described as subbolivescens by Smith, but then I discovered due to my religious sequencing that actually we have another relative there. And now I have finally been able to learn how to tell it apart with moderate exactness. Some of the professional mycologists, and this is one part that annoys me about professional mycologists, they are hell-bent to find difference, and they tend to invent them. When they can't find a difference in the species, they tend to invent them. And that becomes, as Elsa says, not science but poetry. Sometimes you have to admit, we cannot tell them apart. You have to be honest about it. Don't be deceitful to yourself. Don't lie to yourself. Don't lie to other people. You can say, I don't know. The spring chords from Sierra Nevada, I did a couple of exercises after we described them to tell them apart. My success rate was about 50%, you know. So sometimes you have to understand that some things you can't quite tell apart, and that's why you have to cheat. And again, this very beautiful species, you know, that is Xanthoporphyrus, you know, this one I think is poisonous. But again, the trees, everything I have on subtree, I have a clear understanding where it is. I'm a great believer in closely related species. I go to check the citrinus. Here is very important is that you need to have a big literature. I've spent probably $20,000 on books, as they're not as useful to me now as they used to be before. It's very nice to easily find closely related species and see what they look like, and also being current on the journals. There are a couple of European journals that I check constantly to be able to draw conclusions and see like, I see now how these are from, you know, how these are similar. And one of the many collochroid cords, I thought there are 3 species in Sierra Nevada. I thought they're the same. They're all distinctly different in various different places of the trees. So you find a lot of these kind of, you know, every discovery gives you so much joy. People are happy when they find a bolete. I'm happy when I discover something. I want to share it. Unfortunately, very few people care. You know, this is like the few cortinariologists that we only exchange emails and say, hey, check, see what I found here. This is so weird, you know. So that's how we go about it.
Hey, Dimitar, do you have any ideas on the chemical ecology of Cortinarius toxins? Like for what function did Orelonine evolve?
I actually don't. I mean, the Orelonine is very, very distinct from what I understand. Some of the poisonous Cortinarians developed the muscarine, same thing. You have it in some of the Lepiotus, that also works also, they develop muscarine, but anything that is toxic, to tell you, no? I thought that some Lepiotus have muscarine.
No,
No? Oh,
muscarine?
yeah,
No.
I mean, have the same poisons as the Amanitas.
As Amanita phalloides, but not muscarine.
Oh, really? Okay. I
It's the
remember.
other stuff.
The
Sorry.
other stuff. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Got it.
Sorry,
But,
totally.
Sometimes you have sometimes, most of the times you find toxins which appear in other groups as well. But I have not studied because anything that deals with toxicology turns me off. It's like pathology, dealing with death, and I don't like that. So, but I do pay attention, but I'm not as versed as other people are. I actually don't know who is very, very well versed, but I know that Orelonine is something which is distinct, but how it evolved, we don't know. In Amanita, it's probably more relevant. There was a study showing that some of these poisons developed as a result of metabolysis, and they even developed some genetic means to grow Amanita phalloides without poison. But I haven't been paying too much attention. What are you using for pattern matching these reads? Nico, can you be more clear? What do you mean by pattern matching?
Yeah, what software are you using when you're using these reads to? Are you running these through GenBank or what?
No. These I'm using several, but I'm mostly using Mega. Mega is one of the most useful tools out there. That it's accessible, very easy to use. This Mega software is the one that I use the most. I have experimented twice in the last 10 years with a great variety of other tools, but this one I find to be so beautiful. Now, as far as running the trees, for speed, actually creating these huge alignments, running something that is 1,640 species, it's pretty expensive operation. I use something called MAFT, M-A-F-T, and I run it using 16 to 32 threads, and it runs on a Mac. It runs 10 times faster than on a PC. I could not do any kind of phylogeny on PC at some point. So on a Mac right now, I run huge trees, and every time somebody brings a few new ones, I have to rerun it, and it usually takes me, well, it used to be like 3-day run. Now it's down to 3-4 hours. But afterwards, I use Mega, and I use maximum likelihood method for discerning the likely evolution. There are several different methods, the parsimony, and so forth. But I like those statistically based methods. Like likelihood is probably the more reliable. And again, this is one area that deserves a separate talk. An area where a lot of mycologists kind of follow the train, because it requires a little bit of inclination towards mathematics. It's not hard, but why is it the fundamental question, why certain transitions of these four, groups A, G, T, C are more likely than others? This is deep statistics, based on prior knowledge. So you use prior knowledge to construct future expectation of certain kind of evolution. And there's something called Markov chains and stuff that, mathematicians use it for this thing, for trying to predict the market, and so forth. But it's heavy mathematics. We don't need to know that. We need to use it and then to try to make sense of it afterwards. By making sense, you need to verify, because sometimes you find strange results. Obviously, something went wrong. So it's good to verify and gain confidence by saying, does that data make sense? And then talking to the other cortinariologists, probably use different tools, and you all agree, you know, one of the species that we're describing right now is, as I was saying earlier, Cortinarius habus. You know, one less lonely rider named in some genus Delamonia. This one is kind of to the side of the other ones. Let me show you here. The paper is just out. So again, this is collection from Bulgaria. This is my collection. My photography, and I'm not at all exquisite photographer like some other guys like Nosh, you know, and so forth, but it is critical, and this is where most mycologists fall short. But when I showed the tree, this one kind of falls separately. And again, I had my own collection. I noticed it's separate. The other mycologists noticed, then we got together, and now we have a picture. France, England, Bulgaria, Hungary. Gives you some idea of where this thing occurs. It seems to be on the broadleaf trees, mainly Fagus, speaking of the host. So, you know, when we do use the different software, we compare notes in the end of the day. And as Emma said, you know, if you use just one genetic marker to try to construct a big tree, you're probably going to go into problems. So that's how we calibrate our understanding. But it's very important to work as a team to see, you know, to confirm our findings. Well, I mean, I think it is fair to say that they also give us a pretty good idea about evolution. It is, as I said, how certain nucleotides transition into others. It's not random. If it was random, they would say, oh, it does not give us a clue as to evolution. But they are far from random. You find that some don't transition into others, and this is where the statistical methods help. You know, to really be able to see what is the most likely, you know, what is the most likely path. And this has been double, triple verified. So they don't only show distance, they actually do show likely evolutionary path. How perfect it is, it's as perfect as our tools at the moment. I'm sure somebody's going to find better tool, you know, after a few years. But at the moment, I think they are good, and they're also believable, and they're also supported by other evidence. You know, when you start really looking into things, then you discover that, these things that we group together due to the genetic markers, they actually have a couple of unique common features, which is a kind of supporting evidence. So they are not random. This is not some BS that people are using. Evolution, you know, construction of evolution is decent. As, you know, be able to determine speciation, whether two species are exactly the same or different, that is harder. And I'm sure that they're going to find errors, but I think that the evolutionary trees are decent, reasonable. And you look at this weird coloration for a cort, almost looks like some kind of a hebeloma, like it is hygrophonous, you know. And some of the description now part is, how do you describe this thing? You know, this was intimidating to me as a beginner, you know, how do I describe this thing, you know? And then you see that a lot of professional mycologists, by the way, it's nice to see supporting evidence. This is my collection, this is another person's collection. And they also show these streaks and this inner fibrillose cap and so forth. And it's very nice when we come together. If we work in isolation, we can never put a good piece of information out there. But also it's variable, it doesn't always occur. And it's, you know, to me, it was actually fun to get into this forbidding world of weird stuff and, you know, a lot of tradition, how you do things, how you say things, how you spell things, and so forth. So it's a little bit of a forbidding world, you know, you kind of enter, but you become part of it soon, and then it becomes fun. So
Any other questions?
Well, while we're waiting, Dimitar, thank you so much for
thank you guys.
getting up early and making this presentation. It was a heck of a presentation. We very much appreciate it.
A little bit overloaded. My wife usually, when she listens to this, criticizes me that I talk too much, but you know, there is a lot of information here.
Well, it's hard to give a good presentation without talking too much.
But we can continue this. I really enjoy now working with new people who are coming. You know, Shannon is coming into the game, describing things. You know, as I said, you know, Noah, we have a couple of species that we've named that with him as well. Thank you. We have named species after after Elsa. She didn't like the way it was published, but the species is the most beautiful one, you know.
Oh, nice.
So now Pastorino, Ron Pastorino, we're gonna honor because he's been a super nice guy, the most patient and, you know, pleasant individual who's done some significant collections. So that's how we should build the tradition. And again, there is more work than we can possibly handle. So there is no place for competition yet. There is a lot more work than we can. There is work for everybody. You know? So
Let's hear it for collaboration. Hello, that's great.
yeah, very important. I wish we had the same thing in Russula world. We do not, and that has been one of the stumbling blocks for me as well. The guys in Europe, they're a little aloof, you know. French-speaking people, you know, that kind of reaching them is a little bit hard. Not, I mean, I'm joking here, but you know, we don't have that in Russula, and that's why things are not what they would be. But once I'm done with Cortinarius and I get a little bit older, I'm gonna sit down and do. That's my ambition. If I don't die, there's a significant amount of work because that's a field where I right now believe that I have a lot of knowledge that, you know, it's completely hidden to the world. So. And then when I'm done with this, I'm going to do some Lepiota studies.
Watch out, Elsa.
So, okay.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I guess all we can do is thank you, Dimitar. This is really
Thank
great
you.
and fascinating. A lot of the science is over my head, but I have to say I really love your visual trees. I love having pictures instead of just names and words. So thank you for showing us those beautiful pictorial trees, if that's the right word.
It is. So I'm going to come and see you guys. I really want to participate in the January events. I've told my wife I'm going back to the States for that. That I really want to kind of see the crowd. Is Mike Wood still active? Are these members still around, or they don't show up much?
Still around,
Yeah.
but you know, COVID's made things weird.
Okay.
Mike Wood told me that he may join the ID event the night before the fair.
Okay. So that used to be the most fascinating event, and I haven't done it in a few years, but I really want to rejoin again.
Well, maybe
Well,
you
we'll
can
take
help
that
us
as a
with the ID.
promise.
Yeah, I would say so.
We need you.
We'll have lunch.
Actually, there will be a lot of new names. Now
Mhm.
we can actually start putting a lot of new. Before for the Cortinarius, we used to put names which are kind of the best that we could. Now we're gonna do a lot better, but we need to. I don't know if you still have those cards. We need to sit down and rewrite them completely, review them. So
Please join us. We would really love that.
yep.
Yeah, and if you come, Ron will come.
Ah, excellent, Ron.
Oh. It's like a daisy chain.
Mhm.
Yeah, domino. So guys, this has been fun. And
Well, thanks again.
one last word, you know, the California generally I found very warm welcome amongst the academic community in California. This would not have been possible to be done in Bulgaria because mostly in Europe, because they're a little bit more, no, they are a little bit more stuck up. the Americans in that respect are the easiest going and so forth. You know, so she's gonna beat me up.
Elsa, do you have a comment?
No, I'll keep it. I'll tell it privately. I don't
Okay.
agree.
Okay.
Perhaps. Okay.
Okay, guys. Thank you. Yep.
Good night.
Good night.
Talk to you.